What was the name of the owl in this episode? Who? What do you mean who? I'm asking the name of the owl. You remember the owl in this episode? Who? Tell me you couldn't see the owl. Like, remember when she grabbed the rat and she put it in the cage? What is his name? Whose name? The goddamn owl. What is his name? Whose name? Oh my god. What is the owl's name? The owl's name is who? Oh. So Watchmen season 1 episode 3 entitled She Was Killed by Space Junk, I would say is the most comic book connected episode of the Watchmen series so far. In that it follows Detective Laurie Blake. And if you don't know, Laurie Blake is Laurie Uspesic, I think I'm saying that right, who was the second Silk Spectre in the comic books. And this is her first introduction in this post-Watchmen comic book world. And in this, she's an FBI agent. And not only an FBI agent, but the fact that her last name is Laurie Blake showed that she accepted comedian Edward Blake as her father, that she actually changed her last name. And I forgot to mention that Laurie Blake is played by Jean Smart. And I've never seen her in anything before, but just based on this first episode, I love this actress. Like, she is great in this role. And you get to see that Laurie Blake, being a former vigilante herself, is now basically a vigilante hunter, because you do find out that despite the Keene Act being a thing that was in place since the original Watchmen, there are still vigilantes in this world. And so the FBI stages a sting to capture this guy who we find out later is called the Shadow Man or something along those lines. And before that, she's captured another guy named the Ravager. So basically she has a long rap sheet of capturing vigilantes. So after a job well done, she's tired, she wants to go home, she wants to have a nightcap, she plays some music at home, and she pulls out this mysterious case, and when she opens it, there's this blue light that emanates from the case, and you're like, what the hell is in that case? And you don't get to find out right then, but you find out later on what's in that case, but I'll get to that later. So we get to see more of Senator Keene in this episode, played by James Wolk. And in this episode, granted, this isn't the first time we've seen Senator Keene, but in this episode, I was looking at Senator Keene like, hey, Senator Keene, and I'm like, Senator Keene could get it. And so in this episode, you learn that Senator Keene is behind the Defense of Police Act, which is actually the legislation that allowed for police to basically go around as masked vigilantes, more or less. And it's an interesting piece of information, which, if you're familiar with the comic book, it was the Keene Act from the comic book in the 80s that outlawed vigilantes, and I'm guessing that was his father that enacted that. But then this Senator Keene basically is more or less reinstating vigilantes and having them work for the government with the Defense of Police Act, which they actually nicknamed DOPA. And I'm like, that sounds a lot like DOMA, which is the Defense Against Marriage Act, which is a thing that outlawed gay marriage. So I'm just like, this doesn't sound like it's going to ultimately end up being good legislation. And you also learn that this legislation is only valid in Oklahoma, and other states are looking to enact it. So in order to secure his potential run for the presidency, because Senator Keene does have higher aspirations than just being a senator, most politicians do, he's sending Laurie Blake to Tulsa, Oklahoma to investigate the death of Chief Judd. And also in the scene, you get to learn that Laurie has a pet owl, which more than likely was a reference to Night Owl, her former boyfriend. And they even reference Night Owl in this because in order to convince Laurie to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, because she didn't want to go, Senator Keene basically dangles some low-hanging fruit in front of her and is like, you know, as president, I can pardon whomever I want. So that basically alludes to the fact that Night Owl, aka Daniel Dryberg, is locked up somewhere for whatever reason. We don't know why yet. Hopefully we'll learn more about that later. And then also in the same scene, you get to see she has a huge portrait behind her of Night Owl, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan, and her. So next scene, you jump to the FBI headquarters. You get to learn more about the history and the genesis of the 7th Cavalry. They propped up basically as a response to the Victims Against Racial Violence Act, which is basically reparations for black people against all the Jim Crow, segregation, slavery, and all the stuff that happened throughout American history, really. And because of that, a lot of black people have been moving to Tulsa, Oklahoma, starting businesses and stuff like that. And the chief of police said a line that kind of hit me, and I was like, I became real black at that moment when he was like, we all know how white people can become so accommodating when people of color start to prosper. And I was like, yeah, just pick up a history book and look at any black community throughout history. When they start to prosper, what happens? White people come in and destroy the communities. And I kind of went through some of that in my episode 1 review. I talked about all the race riots that happened throughout America. Most of that was in thriving black communities. I mean, hell, this show centers on the Tulsa Race Massacre, aka the Black Wall Street. So she goes to Oklahoma with the FBI partner of hers that we learn his name is Petey, and he has a PhD in history. And so they talk a little bit more and expand the world, and they bring up the 1977 cop riot, which Dr. Manhattan was a part of, which is part of the comics, which I believe is the inciting incident to even start the Keene Act. And so they get to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And basically, from the moment they land, she comes to town showing that she has the biggest dick in town. Literally, once we get to the end. But again, I'll get to that later. And so we actually finally learned the name of the masked vigilante cop that was in the night owl-like flying contraption in the first episode that crashed with Chief Officer Judd. Her name is Pirate Jenny. And so we see all the cops grabbing and raiding all these people that they believe to be connected to the 7th Cavalry and possibly killed Chief Judd. And while watching this scene, I was just like, how are they any different from the 7th Cavalry? Because I'm pretty sure most of the people that they've captured here aren't guilty of anything. You even see Looking Glass release one guy who they say is clear. And it's like, okay, so you just rounded up that guy that's innocent. Now he's probably going to harbor some feelings against the cops and probably join the 7th Cavalry when he probably even wasn't a member of the 7th Cavalry to begin with. So that's an interesting angle that they included in this show. And actually, if something like that were to happen, I believe the CIA coined the term blowback, where your actions do have unforeseen consequences that could blow back on you. We also get an explanation of the machine that we saw Looking Glass use in the first episode when he was interrogating one of the members of the 7th Cavalry, and Laurie basically coins it the racist detector. That's essentially what it is, and it kind of reminds me of the implicit bias test that you can take where certain images flash before your eyes really quickly and you have to respond whether like it's right or wrong, and that basically can determine whether you have implicit biases. It just seems like a more dredged up version of that. And once again, Laurie showing that she has the biggest dick in town. She basically knows who all these cops are. She reveals to Looking Glass that she knows who his identity is. She reveals that she knows who Sister Night is. And Looking Glass, or now we know him as Wade, he was caught off guard by that. He didn't know she knew. And he couldn't lie to her at that point because basically she checkmated him. And she's showing that she's not to be underestimated. And I'll get to that later because I didn't mention that there's something that happens in the beginning of this episode that I purposely left out that I'll get to later. And so Laurie finds out that the funeral to bury Chief Judd is actually that same day. And it's there that she meets Angela, and she introduces herself, and she already lets them know. She pretty much knows who they are. She even names Angela's husband, and he's confused. He's like, who are you? Do I know you? And she plays it off to calm his suspicions. She's basically more or less letting Angela know she knows what's going on, to the point that she says to her, like, you know how I can tell the difference between a vigilante and a masked cop? And Angela's like, how? She's like, there isn't a difference. Basically letting her know, A, she's on the hunt, and B, she doesn't agree with the fact that these cops are allowed to wear masks. And so with that, the funeral is proceeding with Chief Judd and Angela speaking, and she's giving a few words because Chief Judd and Angela had a pact that if one of them died before the other, they would give them words or tell them what they wanted the other to say. And during that moment, we saw that a member of the 7th Cavalry snuck into the funeral by digging a hole underground, kind of Bugs Bunny style, sneaking into the funeral with a bomb on his chest, basically wanting to go after Senator Keene. And he says to the cops, like, if you touch me, if you kill me, there's a bomb connected to my heart and it's gonna go off. And regardless of that warning, Agent Blake, she still shot him in the head, not believing him, because she says throughout her line of work, there's always somebody that says, oh, this bomb, if you kill me, it's gonna go off, and it never does. But this guy wasn't lying, because as soon as she shot him in the head, you heard that ticking time bomb going off. And so Sister Night, Angela, jumped into the fray, and she dropped the guy in the grave and dropped Chief Judd's casket over the grave to absorb most of the blast impact, saving everyone. And so after that incident, you saw a bunch of reporters swarm, some more world building and Easter eggs being slipped into this series, where one of the reporters asked about Senator Keene's opinion on the fact that we learned that the Russians are building their own intrinsic field generator, which, if you're familiar with the comic book, that's the very same thing that created Dr. Manhattan. So it seems like the Russians are trying to create their own Dr. Manhattan, or I guess he would be called Dr. Moscow, I don't know. And in this scene, when you had Senator Keene, he was looking all roughed up and he had the blood all over him, he had his tie untangled. I was still like, hey, Senator Keene. Also in this episode, you jump back to Adrian Veidt, and he's putting the new Mr. Phillips in what looks like, I guess, a space suit. And I was wondering, I was like, what is he trying to do? This new Mr. Phillips ends up dying and his whole body is completely frozen, and you don't really find out what he's doing. And I was like, is he trying to send his Mr. Phillips person to Mars? Is he trying to make contact with Dr. Manhattan? That's the only thing I could think of that he's doing. And so with that, you find that he's on the property of somebody called the Game Master, and they have a little tit for tat that reminded me of, even though I didn't see the musical, I have the musical soundtrack and I've listened to every single song and I can sing every single lyric, and it reminded me of the tit for tat that both Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton were having at the end of the play, where they were writing each other letters and still saying, I have the honor to be your obedient servant, A. Ham, A. Burr. So that's what that scene reminded me of. And so we get back to one of my favorite scenes in this episode where there's basically a sparring match, a dick measuring contest between Agent Blake and Sister Knight. And basically, she also lets her know that she knows there was somebody else at the crime scene where Chief Judd was hanged because she found Will's wheelchair tracks at the base of the tree. Agent Blake is letting her know that she knows what's going on, and she's on to her to the point that she knows she found a secret compartment in Chief Judd's closet. And she's like, how do you even know about that? And again, a reference to the comic book when her father, Edward Blake, the comedian, died. He had a secret compartment, which is where his mass vigilante costume stuff was. And so she says ever since then, she always checks for a secret compartment. And as you know from the previous episode, it had a KKK robe, but Angela removed the robe. And so in my mind, I think that Laurie thinks that maybe Chief Judd was a vigilante. Obviously, she doesn't know it was a KKK robe, but she basically says to her, like, I'm on to you. You might think you're doing a good thing, but you're really not. What you're doing is illegal, and I eat good guys for breakfast. So Laurie goes back to her hotel room, and she's ready to wind down for the night. And we finally get to see what was in that case. And I was like, oh my God. She pulls out basically a big blue dildo that's supposed to be modeled after Dr. Manhattan. And I was like, Laurie, girl, like, I know you're still feeding for John, but that thing was huge. I was like, if you can take all that, like, teach me your secret, because that thing was like... I was like, is that what he was doing to you all that time? But she decides to put it away, and she actually gets some from the FBI, from her FBI partner. She actually made him wear a mask. So they were doing some role playing. Good for you, girl. I ain't shaming you at all. Get you some however you need to get it. I guess we know Laurie's not participating in No Nut November. Who am I kidding? I already failed that a couple times already. I know one thing though. You know how shows will sometimes release merchandise or prop replicas? We need to get a prop replica of that Dr. Manhattan Blue Magic, if you know what I'm saying. Ooh, Laurie girl, I congratulate you for that one. And so the episode ends how it began, and I purposely left this out because throughout the episode, there's this device that you can use to make contact with Mars and speak with Dr. Manhattan. He's not going to speak back to you. Supposedly, he can hear all communications. And this is something that she's been doing throughout the 35 years since Dr. Manhattan has left. She's always went to that phone to call him to the point that she's a platinum member. And throughout the episode, she was telling him stories in the form of jokes. And I'm assuming that's another reference to the fact that her father is the comedian. And one of the jokes that she tells is about a bricklayer trying to pass on his legacy to his daughter. And the story ends where she throws a brick up into the air and she makes it seem like she messed up the joke. And then she moves on to a different joke where basically she calls out Night Owl, she calls out Ozymandias, and she calls out Dr. Manhattan. And there's even a reference to something that Dr. Manhattan says in the comics about a live body and a dead body having the same number of particles. And each person that she calls out is at the pearly white gates of heaven trying to get into heaven, and God sends them all to hell. And basically the joke ends where God sees this girl that he doesn't even know who this girl is, and I'm assuming this girl is her, and she gets over on God to the point that the joke ends with the joke that she mentioned at the beginning where she threw a brick up into the air. She made it seem like she messed up the joke. It comes back around at the end, and it's the thing that kills God. And basically that's how she's able to go into heaven. And for me, the way I took it is people underestimate Laurie, and considering she's the only one left standing, she's basically implying that she's the dangerous one. She's the one that needs to be feared. She's the one that basically won in the end. That's what I got. That's what I got from the joke that she was telling, not to underestimate her. So once she's done with the conversation and the conversation transmits to Mars, she walks away and she's gonna finish her night. And thankfully she wasn't walking fast like how we walk in New York, because if she was walking any faster, the title of this episode, She Was Killed by Space Junk, would have came true. The car that got snatched away with Will in it in the last episode lands in the exact same spot, but this time it's pretty much destroyed. And you get to see that Mars is more illuminated. So you kind of left wondering, did Dr. Manhattan send that car back? Did that car end up going to Mars? Is Will actually Dr. Manhattan? Because he does make a mention to the point that he needs to take his pills or something like that, and he hasn't been home in a while or something. And the whole reference of Dr. Manhattan not being able to appear human, this show just keeps dropping a lot more questions that get me excited about the next episode. And I definitely feel like because they keep keep teasing Dr. Manhattan. He's gonna show up at some point. But yeah, I love this episode. I love Laurie Blake. I love Jean Smart as this character. I would say just like all the other episodes, this episode is a blockbuster. Anyway, so have you seen Watchmen episode 3? What did you think about it? Let me know down in the comment section below. Also, if you can't hit that thumbs up button and like this video to really help out the channel. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, please check out the other videos on my channel. If you like what you see, please subscribe for more and hit that bell notification button so you're alerted every single time I post a new video. And tell your friends, families, and neighbors about my channel to help me continue to grow. And as always, I'll catch you guys next time.